The NBA trade deadline is an unbelievably pivotal moment in the season for every single team in the NBA. There are teams that have literally set themselves up to win titles in that season and following seasons, or completely ruin their teams just based off moves that they made at the trade deadline. And in this video, I'm going to go back and look at every single trade deadline since 2010, pick one trade for each of those years, and rank the craziest, the best NBA trade deadline trades since 2010. And with that said, you're probably thinking that this first trade is going to be out of control. It's going to be unbelievable. Not quite. This is a nice reminder that NBA trade deadlines used to be much less exciting. Our first year that we're going to cover, number 13 on the list, is 2014. Quite literally in my notes, it says nothing. It says boring. Nothing happened at this deadline. I mean, we're talking about guys like Andre Miller getting traded. We're talking about random role players for second round picks. It's barely worth putting in the video, but I put it here at number 13. It's also nice because ranking videos are difficult. It's nice to start off with an easy one. Moving on now to number 12, and that is 2016. The 2016 NBA trade deadline was not a crazy exciting one either, but we do have a relatively significant deal here. Jeff Green going from Memphis to the Clippers in exchange for a future first round pick. Now, Jeff Green doesn't do a ton with the Clippers. We know that he's jumped around to a lot of different teams, but most interestingly, Memphis gets that first, uses it later on, and that first round pick ends up in Philadelphia and becomes Matisse Thybulle. Again, certainly from a concept perspective, the NBA trade deadline has gotten a lot better in recent years. Next up now is 2013, and in this deal, the Bucks get Tobias Harris in exchange for JJ Redick. There's other pieces there, but essentially that's how the trade breaks down. And this is interesting for a couple of different reasons. One, JJ Redick later on, once he went from Milwaukee then on to the Clippers, is known as a productive, really good NBA player. But up until this point, obviously being traded as such a young player, he hadn't really done anything in the league. And then Tobias Harris goes from Milwaukee to Detroit to the Clippers to Philadelphia. He's a part of the Blake Griffin trade, going from Detroit to the Clippers. There's a lot of pieces in this deal that we continue to see throughout the history of the league. And now, of course, with Tobias Harris still playing. And again, this is an indicator of like, hey, the trade deadline didn't used to be as big of a deal, but these guys are still critically important, at least Tobias Harris is, to where the league is right now. Okay, now we move on to 2018, and this deal has real championship and finals level implications. I put this deal on the screen. Essentially, it's Cleveland acquiring Rodney Hood as well as George Hill. They restructured their roster in a couple of different moves like this at the 2018 trade deadline, but this, of course, is a roster that they end up bringing to the finals in 2018. Unsuccessfully, they were not able to win the title in 2018, of course, going up an incredible Warriors team, but this is a group that they just continue to try and change around and restructure around LeBron. LeBron ultimately leaves in the following offseason, but it's important to understanding the story of that 2018 season. Now we move on to the 2010 NBA trade deadline, and there's a reason that I've gone through the first couple of entries in this video very, very quickly. It's because I wanted to get to this point. This is the point in which we see really, truly impactful long-term impacts of these trade deadline deals, and this one includes a big name. The New York Knicks trade for Tracy McGrady in 2010, and off the top of your head, if you're not thinking about the context of the league at that point, it might seem like a really big deal. Tracy McGrady, a few years before, was one of the best players in the entire league, and the Knicks, of course, are one of the marquee franchises in the league, at least in terms of popularity. But ultimately, this had a completely different premise and purpose for the New York Knicks. They wanted Tracy McGrady because they wanted the expiring contract so that they could then go out and have 2 max cap space slots in 2010. They didn't really give up a ton in exchange for McGrady. It was all about money. He only played like 25 games for them. They didn't make the playoffs, and had it worked out, had they made some bigger signings in 2010, remember, this is the LeBron, Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, Carlos Boozer. This is that summer. Everybody's gearing up. They take meetings with LeBron. They take meetings with Dwayne Wade. They feel like they have as good of an opportunity as any other team in the league to bring in LeBron in free agency. And had it worked out, this deal in 2010 of the trade deadline would have been incredibly impactful, arguably one of the most impactful trades in NBA history, if it then allowed them to sign LeBron and D Wade. And that era of Heat basketball potentially could have taken place in New York. Obviously, as we all know, they end up with Amari Stoudemire. In 2011, a handful of months later, they trade for Carmelo Anthony, and none of this stuff actually ends up happening, but it's still very interesting to look back on, and is one of, if not the most impactful and influential deals at that 2010 trade deadline. Moving on now to 2019, and this trade involves 2 of the bigger names in recent Philadelphia 76ers basketball history, and that is Markelle Fultz and Tyrese Maxey. In this deal, less than 2 years after selecting Markelle Fultz first overall in the 2017 draft, Philadelphia just dumps the guy. They just get rid of him. They get Jonathan Simmons and a second round pick and a first round pick that initially was Philadelphia, and this deal allows them to get their own first round pick back contract, that first round pick ends up becoming Tyrese Maxey. And so ultimately, it's a positive trade for Philadelphia. Tyrese Maxey is an incredible player for them, someone that's going to continue to grow and develop. Has been a great story coming out of that draft. But to get that level of value less than 2 years after selecting a guy first overall is obviously not ideal. And Markelle Fultz is still kind of turning things around, could still be a really good player there in Orlando. But when you think about trade deadline deals, there's not really many as disappointing and upsetting as trading away someone as talented as Markelle Fultz as quickly as Philadelphia ended up doing so. Moving on now to 2017, and this is a trade that features a young player that becomes a future all-star, that becomes a critical piece in one of the biggest trades in recent NBA history. In this deal, Washington gets Bojan Bogdanovic from the Brooklyn Nets in exchange for essentially a late first-round pick, and that late first-round pick ends up becoming Jarrett Allen, who last year was an all-star, is a critical part of what's happening in Cleveland, is now making $20 million a year on a $100 million contract, and was a critical piece of that James Harden trade that got Harden to Brooklyn and ultimately got switched around and then traded to Philadelphia not too long after. And Jarrett Allen was a pretty critical part of that trade because Houston could have had Jarrett Allen. They decided instead to get a first round pick from Cleveland, but he was still in that deal. You could make the argument that that deal might not happen if the Nets don't have Jarrett Allen. And Bogdanovic, as is normally the case for the Wizards, left in the offseason. They traded a first round pick away for a guy that made a playoff run with them, and then that was basically it. But this trade has a ton of influence on how the league looks right now. Next up now, we go to the 2015 NBA trade deadline, and this deal essentially comes down to Goran Dragic being traded from Phoenix to Miami. This is a new era of Miami Heat basketball. They're trying to figure out what they can do now post LeBron. They trade for Dragic to go along with Chris Bosh, and they actually create a pretty good team there once they're healthy. And of course, Dragic was a critical piece of the team there in Miami that made the run to the finals in the bubble in 2020. And for Phoenix, this trade indirectly ends up with them getting Mikal Bridges later on in the draft. The draft compensation that they got in this deal then gets turned around essentially in exchange for Mikal Bridges, who is a critical part of a team not only that made the finals a few years ago, but also obviously is a big part of the future moving forward for Phoenix. And so even though at the time it seemed like Miami was just giving up a little bit of future value in exchange for Goran Dragic, this is a great example of a win-win trade that happened at the trade deadline. We move on now to 2021, the most recent selection so far in the list, and this is one of my favorite deals. Nikola Vucevic going to Chicago essentially in exchange for Wendell Carter Jr. and 2 future first-round picks, one of which has been conveyed, becomes Franz Wagner, and the other is the top 4 protected selection in the 2023 NBA draft from Chicago. And that is critically important to understanding this trade, because I've talked about this before in the past. You could make the argument that the way that Chicago is currently structured, Wendell Carter Jr. would have been a better fit for their roster right now than Vucevic is, without even accounting for all the other compensation. But Franz Wagner is legitimately one of the best players coming out of that draft class, a draft class that is absolutely stacked. He's a huge part of the foundation and what Orlando is building here moving forward. And they could very easily maybe go on a run later in the year, or make the play-in game, make the playoffs, and then Orlando could still have like the 6th or the 7th pick in this draft. The only way Chicago retains this pick is if it lands in the top 4, and that is an astronomical amount of value for a player Nikola Vucevic that, yes, is good, borderline all-star caliber, but also is a free agent this offseason, someone that they were not able to extend long-term as of right now. And for Orlando to get that level of value, even just Wendell Carter Jr. and like a late first-round pick would have been solid value for Vucevic, but potentially 2 foundational building blocks. This is what I'm talking about in the intro. Teams setting themselves up for future success at the trade deadline. That's exactly what's happening here and what did happen for Orlando in 2021. Next up now is just the following year, and that is 2022. This, of course, is the James Harden trade going from Brooklyn to Philadelphia in exchange for Ben Simmons, some draft compensation, and Seth Curry. Now, this is a deal that I think we're going to look back on a long time from now and fully understand exactly what happened here. But my memory of this, the most interesting part of this, is just how insane of a deadline this was and all the context around this deal in particular. The only reason it wasn't ranked a little bit higher is a lot of the upcoming trades that we're going to talk about have real championship or finals implications, and this deal is so recent that we don't really understand the context of it fully. But of course, when you're talking about crazy, insane trades and insane deadlines, this one is right up there. From a couple of weeks prior, everything seeming fine with Harden, and then all of a sudden he just has to go to Philadelphia. He can't go anywhere else. You have Simmons, who hasn't played in so long. We've gone over it all. This has to be one of the craziest trade deadline moves of the last 10 to 15 years. And now we go all the way back to 2012. I know I said earlier that NBA trade deadline used to not be that interesting. Well, sometimes it works out completely differently than you would have expected. This is a deal that starts the Damian Lillard era in Portland. The Nets, the New Jersey Nets at the time, they trade for Gerald Wallace in exchange for some pieces and their upcoming draft pick in the 2012 NBA draft. And famously, that pick was only protected through the first couple of selections in the draft because, as Billy King said later, he only felt like there were a couple of players at the top of the draft that were worth selecting in the first place. Now, of course, Dame ends up going 6th in that draft. He's one of the best players in the draft. He's one of the best players in the league right now and has been a franchise cornerstone, the definition of that term for Portland. And to make things even worse for Brooklyn, not only was Gerald Wallace a guy that they had to sign to a new contract the following offseason, they had absolutely no leverage to get a decent contract out of the guy because they just traded all this draft capital, but also it was very easy to foresee at the time that this was a bad idea. They had one of the worst records in the conference at the time that they made the deal. Just think for a second about a team trading, for example, OG Anunoby or someone even less of a caliber of player than that, trading away a top 3, top 4 protected pick in the upcoming draft when they're 15 games below 500 in exchange for a player that is not a star. It would never happen. Everybody would lose their mind. This is a great example of how crazy some of these NBA trades used to be. We're down now to just our last 2 years, and I saved these two for the top because both of them have direct championship implications. And this year is 2020. It's one of my favorite trades to talk about. It's Andrew Wiggins in exchange for D'Angelo Russell. There's also been some draft compensation involved, but that's the core of the deal. And D'Angelo Russell in Minnesota, in my opinion, has not been a very successful adventure. But for Golden State, you could argue pretty easily that they don't win the title last year without Andrew Wiggins on their roster. Like, obviously, they have all these important, incredible players. Steph was amazing, but their ability to have someone out there that could guard, that could rebound, and could score the way that Wiggins could, not only was incredibly impactful, helped them win the title, but also was completely unforeseen at the time that they made the deal. Everybody thought that Wiggins was one of the worst contracts in the entire league. They had to get draft compensation back from Minnesota just to take on Wiggins in exchange for D'Angelo Russell, and now that's kind of flipped. Like, D'Lo's contract isn't looking so hot, and Wiggins is proven now to be a winning championship caliber player, at least in the system that they have there in Golden State. It's a home run deal for Golden State. Like I said, it's a deal that led arguably directly to a title and sets them up well moving forward. And they were the team that got the draft pick out of the trade. It's one of my favorite trades ever to talk about. And now our last entry is the 2011 NBA trade deadline, going almost all the way back to the beginning of this era that we're talking about. And this trade reads as the Clippers trading Baron Davis and Kyrie Irving to Cleveland in exchange for Mo Williams and Jamario Moon. That's literally how it reads. Now, technically, Kyrie was a future first-round pick at the time that the deal was made, but that is how the trade reads now. Baron Davis and Kyrie Irving for Mo Williams and Jamario Moon. No disrespect to Mo Williams and Jamario Moon, but that's an absolutely insane trade, and it's similar to what we talked about with Brooklyn earlier, where this is a team that is one of the worst records in the conference at the trade deadline, trading away a draft pick for the upcoming draft with, in this case, no protections, in the Nets case, limited protections. It's an insane deal. It would never happen. So why in the world would the Clippers have done this at the time? Well, they wanted to save some money. They had ideas on being a big free agency destination in the year and two following this deal, and getting rid of Baron Davis's salary helped them do that. And the only way to do that was to attach the first round pick. Now, granted, this doesn't really make it that much better, but the Clippers technically were only supposed to have the 8th pick in the draft. They went into the 2011 draft lottery with the 8th pick in the draft and then, of course, conveyed that to Cleveland. But what ends up happening is Cleveland, who has a higher selection in the draft lottery, they end up at 4 with their own pick, but they get such great luck in the lottery that they get the first overall pick. They draft Kyrie Irving, and you could argue that without that bouncing their way, they don't get LeBron, they don't win the title in 2016. None of that happens if they don't make this deal, if they don't get Kyrie Irving with the first overall pick in a trade in which the Clippers were literally just trying to dump salary. And so I don't really think it's an argument that that is the craziest trade deadline deal since 2010. Those are my rankings. Let me know down in the comment section below how you would rank these. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.